We're now going to talk about the empire that rose in the wake of Alexander's invasion, the Maurya dynasty. The Maurya dynasty was one of the most powerful of all the indigenous states that has ever developed on the Indian subcontinent. The Maurya dynasty unified the majority of the Indian subcontinent under its rule. It was the most extensive Indian territorial state up to this point. The dynasty was responsible for not just the establishment of a powerful state and India obtaining a large portion of the world's or Eurasia's trade, but on top of that, there were numerous scientific, mathematical, and philosophical achievements that emerged in India during this time period, and we're going to talk about all of those. In addition, this is the period of time in which Buddhism begins to explode out of India under the Maurya dynasty's organization. The founder of the Maurya dynasty was Chandragupta Maurya. Chandragupta was heavily influenced by the successes of Alexander, and according to the Greek historian Megasthenes, he actually met Alexander when he was a little boy. What Chandragupta did was he filled the power vacuum left by Alexander with his own creation, the state of his own making. When Alexander invaded India, he destroyed numerous petty kingdoms. We call them petty kingdoms because territorially they were not very large. Population-wise, they were very large. Remember, we're talking about India. So in some of these instances, these petty kingdoms would have, several 100,000 people, and they were all wiped out by Alexander. And this created a massive power vacuum that Chandragupta was able to fill. Chandragupta emerged in a state on the Gangetic Plain, the Ganges River, called the Nanda Empire. He was a nobleman in the Nanda Empire, but he was not part of the ruling family. Chandragupta had an advisor named Kautilya, and Kautilya is one of the most brilliant men of his age. He ended up advising Chandragupta on how to not only overthrow the Nanda Empire, but to create a lasting state in its place that he could then dominate the subcontinent with. And of course, Kautilya was well aware of the destruction that had been left by the invasion of Alexander, how the entire subcontinent's political system had been totally destabilized, and that now was the time for Chandragupta to use his principles, Kautilya's principles, to establish a powerful government and a powerful military. I'd like to take a minute to talk about Kautilya. Kautilya wrote a work called the Arthashastra, and it's kind of like India's version of The Prince by Machiavelli. Kautilya is kind of, people looking at Kautilya, they'll see him as kind of the Machiavelli of India. The problem is that Kautilya lived 1700 years before Machiavelli, right? So if anybody, it's Machiavelli who is the Italian version of Kautilya, given the fact that Kautilya lived so much earlier in history. But Kautilya had kind of principles that we might identify as Machiavellian. He believed that the goal of the ruler should be to establish a strong state, that ethical, moral considerations were not really part of the equation until the security and safety of the state and its efficient running were achieved. So in other words, by any means necessary, the sovereign had to control the population and institute strict laws that could maintain order. Like the legalists in China, whom we talked about, Kautilya believed that human beings were inherently evil, and that because human beings are inherently evil, they have to be controlled with very strict laws, with very, very harsh punishments. And so the Maurya dynasty was able to maintain order over such a wide variety of cultures, subcultures, language groups, ethnic groups, in part because of this very impartial, harsh yet fair legal system created by Kautilya and laid out in the Arthashastra, one of the great works of political philosophy of ancient India. So Kautilya created a bureaucracy similar to that in the Han Dynasty of to the far northeast. He created a very efficient tax system in which even the nobility had to pay a higher percentage of their proceeds as tax. A very large, very powerful army that had the the nobility would still use chariots in India because it's prestigious in Indian civilization to ride chariots, because charioteers like Arjuna, if you remember Arjuna, plays such a monumental role in Hindu epics, right? Like the Mahabharata, right? These great charioteers, these Aryan warriors who are charioteers, are the great culture heroes. So for centuries, even into the Middle Ages, in Hindu kingdoms, people will be employing chariots, even though cavalry, one horse, one rider, are way more effective and efficient and have since eclipsed the chariot. But what, in terms of military readiness, the Mauryas developed a very powerful cavalry arm based on the companions of Alexander's personal cavalry, which he used to great effect. So, with the advice of Kautilya, Chandragupta created a state on the Ganges plain called Magadha that would serve as the basis, as the cornerstone of the Maurya Empire. In time, as he expanded across northern India, he came into conflict with Seleucus Nicator, who was one of the Diadochi, one of the successors of Alexander. When Alexander passed away, his empire was split among his most powerful generals. Well, one of these was Seleucus. Seleucus ruled Persia, and of course we remember that Persia ruled parts of northwestern India, which is what led Alexander initially into the Indian subcontinent, chasing down the remnants of the Persian army. Seleucus wanted to expand his lands to the east, and he also wanted to hold on to many of the lands closer to the Indus River Valley. This brought him into direct conflict with Chandragupta, who was advised by Kautilya. Now, when Alexander fought Porus, Porus was a great fighter. Alexander admired Porus greatly and gave Porus his kingdom back to him as a result of this. But while Porus was a great fighter, he was not a great strategist. Well, Chandragupta was very intelligent himself, and on top of this, he had Kautilya. So he was able to outwit and check the advances of Seleucus and even defeat his army in several engagements. So, and on top of this, Chandragupta, while he realized that he had the kind of home field advantage in these battles, that there would be no advantage to him if the war progressed. That Seleucus had been stopped, but time was on his side. So what Chandragupta did is he, with the advice of Kautilya, negotiated a peace treaty with Seleucus and actually became his ally. As part of the peace agreement, the Maurya Empire and the empire of Seleucus, the Seleucid Empire of Persia, would become allies, and both would guard each other's borders. So the eastern border of Seleucid Persia would be guarded by Chandragupta, and Chandragupta's western border would be guarded by Seleucus. On top of this, they would send each other trade goods, gifts, and also weapons of war. So Chandragupta received a large number of Greek-style swords, spears, suits of armor. On top of this, Chandragupta sent Seleucus 400 war elephants. And these war elephants were very, very effective when Seleucus was fighting against the other of Alexander's generals further to the west. In fact, Seleucus came very close to actually reconquering the entire territory of Alexander because of, in part, due to the gift of war elephants given to him by Chandragupta. So you have this kind of both sides of this conflict ended up being boosted by the peace agreement and by the alliance that was to follow. And the Greek historian Megasthenes is one of the reasons that we know about these very cordial ties between East and West during this period of time. And this benefited both societies. In fact, you had Greek philosophers, artists moving into India, just as had happened in the wake of Alexander's empire. And there was a lot of philosophical ferment as these Greek philosophers were encountering Buddhism. They were encountering Buddhism, which was very appealing, very similar to, in some respects, to the idea of the world of forms of Plato, of Platonic philosophy. And so the Greeks and the Buddhists were inspiring one another. And it would eventually be a heavily Hellenized, Greek-influenced form of Buddhism that would spread to Southeast Asia and into Central Asia. Chandragupta's capital of Pataliputra would become one of the largest cities in the world. It would serve as one of the world's great artistic, philosophical, and spiritual centers as a result. You had Greek philosophers, Chinese philosophers, Indian philosophers, spiritual teachers, mathematicians, astronomers, all coming together in this giant metropolis and influencing each other intellectually. If you read the work of Megasthenes, he talks about the kinds of discoveries that were taking place. And I will talk more about those at the end of this video, of the great intellectual contributions during this period of time. Chandragupta was a very intellectually curious and spiritually intense man. Towards the end of his life, he converted to a burgeoning religion in India called Jainism. If you've ever heard of Jainism, it's one of the great Indian religions. It doesn't have anywhere near the adherents of Hinduism or Buddhism, but it's very similar, and that the goal is to reach moksha. Right? The Buddhists call moksha nirvana, but it's a very similar kind of state of bliss where you escape the cycle of death and rebirth. And we talked about that in our Hinduism and Buddhism video. So the Jains believe that the way to moksha, the way to become enlightened and to leave this struggle, this struggle planet, right? The way to get out is to embrace extreme nonviolence, ahimsa. Now, in Hinduism, ahimsa is also part of Hinduism, particularly for certain castes. For all Jains, ahimsa is the guiding principle. So, for example, no Jains are allowed to eat meat. Jains are not allowed to kill any living organism. If you are a Jain and there is a black widow spider in your house, you have to take that spider outside, right? They're not going to have black widows in India. Whatever equivalents you find. You find a king cobra in your house, and of course there's an actual village in which people take care of king cobras. But you find a king cobra in your house, you have to get him out. You can't kill him, right? Because it's against ahimsa. The serious Jains will go so far that they will actually carry around a long broom, and as they walk, they will brush the dirt in front of them to brush any insects out of the way so that they don't step on anything and inadvertently kill any living creature. Right? So they're strict vegetarians, and they believe in the sanctity and dignity of all animal life. Right? So this was something that Chandragupta converted to as he neared the end of his life. And he favored many Jain temples. We can see here Bhavali, one of the great statues of one of the early teachers of Jainism that many Jains still come to as a source of pilgrimage today. And throughout the centuries, many Jains would become very powerful merchants. They would make a lot of money through trade. The reason for this is that they couldn't farm, because farmers sometimes had to kill animals. And on top of that, even if all they did was grow rice, right, they still had to till the soil, which could kill earthworms and other creatures, which was against Jain belief. And they couldn't be soldiers for obvious reasons. So there weren't a lot of occupations open to them. And one of the few that was commerce. And so they became great merchants. The Jain saints throughout the centuries, the great heroes of the Jain religion, would actually all die in the same way, by voluntarily starving themselves to death, which you can imagine the kind of willpower that is required for that. But that was kind of That was an ultimate sign that one was enlightened and had renounced the flesh by completely going without eating, to the point that you perished from it. Chandragupta was succeeded by his son Bindusara. Bindusara was a very important figure and atypical in many respects, because while he wasn't the great founder and conqueror that his father was, and he wasn't the great conqueror and reformer that his son would later be, he did something kind of remarkable for most monarchies. He lived his life as crown prince and then ruler of a massive, wealthy empire without giving himself over to luxury and to degeneracy. He remained very disciplined. He studied frequently, and he attempted to rule justly. He wanted to preserve the empire created by his father and hand it down to his own son, instead of kind of wasting it on his own excesses. On top of that, he is the epitome of, if it's not broke, don't fix it. The system created by Kautilya, that was based on Kautilya's philosophy of a very strong central government that could be very ruthless, he kind of ramped up this system. He ended up putting Kautilya's practice of kind of a secret police with spies, with agents, with rewards for informing on rebels, etc. He put all of that into practice. So he basically extended not just the empire of his father, but the actual internal system that his father had created. He did wage several wars on the Deccan Plateau, bringing south central and southern Indian rulers, Dravidian Rajas, to heel and adding them to his empire. But he didn't have the kind of dramatic conquests that his father had. On top of this, he continued to maintain close relationships with the Hellenized rulers to the west, the successors of Alexander, right, of his generals, and he continued to trade with Greek-dominated Persia, Syria, and with Greece itself. In fact, one of his favorite commodities was Greek wine. He had a very fond taste for grape wine, which wasn't part of the traditional Indian cuisine. And you'll see this throughout Asian history. In a lot of instances, there will occasionally be a ruler who will have a deep attachment to European wine, like Oda Nobunaga of Japan. Right? European wine was so different from what he was used to that it was a novelty, and some people absolutely detested European wine, fruit wine, but some actually became deeply attached to it. And this is the case of Bindusara. But Bindusara was a very competent ruler who not only kept his father's empire intact, but expanded it and handed it over to his son, who is one of the greatest rulers, not just in Indian history, but in world history, Ashoka the Great. Ashoka was the son of Bindusara and the grandson of Chandragupta. When he inherited his father's throne, he was very much like his father and grandfather in their youths. He was physically fit, he was a great warrior, he was an excellent swordsman, archer, horseman, and he wanted to make a name for himself through military conquest. So he engaged states in the far south in offensive wars, winning them, adding territory to the Mauryan Empire. He maintained the same system created by his grandfather and maintained by his father of secret police, of spies, of very strict laws, strict rewards and punishments, with the philosophy of Kautilya. During one of the wars that he fought, the Kalinga War, which was a war with the central eastern state of Odisha, which was a state that refused to bend the knee to Mauryan dominance, the carnage was very severe. Odisha had a relatively strong army that included elephants, and so these battles resulted in very, very high casualties. The Kalinga War took place in 261 BC, and it was extraordinarily brutal for a number of reasons. First of all, the state was situated, Odisha was situated on the Bay of Bengal, so the trade routes with Southeast Asia were dominated by this kingdom. It left a major gap in Mauryan control, and Ashoka could not leave his flank vulnerable, leaving this kingdom independent. It absolutely had to be absorbed. The problem was that the Kalingans had a very powerful army. As I stated earlier, they had a lot of cavalry, a lot of war elephants. Ashoka himself had many war elephants, and these elephants rampaged across the battlefield, trampling hundreds and hundreds of soldiers. So the battles themselves were extraordinarily brutal. The Odishans fought very, very hard for independence. The Mauryan army fought very, very hard to take away Odisha's independence. You ended up with a situation where about 100,000 soldiers were killed during the war, which we're talking about 261 BC here. Several hundred thousand civilians had died due to being massacred or dying from starvation as a result of the destruction of farmland. And about 150,000 people ended up actually being forcibly deported out of Odisha, and settlers from the core of the Mauryan Empire brought in order to help the government maintain control. So there was a lot of carnage in this war. And Ashoka, who was a great fighter, a great kind of athlete and warrior, a kind of macho figure, who had previously shown little to no fear and little to no hesitation to take the field of battle, was now deeply affected by what had happened during this conflict. He was unable to sleep. He was unable to eat. The things that he saw, that he experienced on the battlefield and off the battlefield during this conflict, deeply shook him. Now today, knowing what we know about Ashoka, we would probably have diagnosed him with something like post-traumatic stress disorder. But he's living in 261 BC. There is no psychology to rely on, so he's having to cope with these mental issues the best he can. And he ends up doing so through a serious turn towards religion. In the aftermath of the Kalinga War, an increasingly distraught Ashoka will convert to Buddhism, and he will take his adopted religion very, very seriously. He will devote much of his reign to building temples, to building convents and monasteries for Buddhist nuns and monks, and for supporting Buddhist missionaries as they travel throughout Asia, particularly into the far south of the Indian subcontinent and into southeastern Asia and upwards into Central Asia. The idea being to spread Buddhism far and wide, and Ashoka will spend a great deal of money and energy on supporting these kinds of ventures. Ashoka crafted a philosophy called Dhamma. Now that's D-H-A-M-M-A, right? That's to distinguish it from Dharma. Dhamma was an ideology that applied to all of Ashoka's subjects, whether you were Buddhist, whether you were Hindu, whether you followed some form of animistic religion, regardless whether you were Jain, no matter what religion you followed, you had to adhere to the basics of Dhamma because it was the basis of Ashoka's legal code. The first principle of Dhamma was non-violence whenever possible. It was ahimsa, like the Jains believed in, like the Buddhists and Hindus believed in, but because it was legal ahimsa, it was practical, right? You were allowed to slaughter animals, but you had to do so in specific ways so as to minimize their suffering. You were not allowed to engage in any activity that would increase the suffering of another organism needlessly. You were not allowed to box. You were not allowed to hunt for anything other than subsistence. These kinds of rules were put in place throughout the entire empire. Ashoka also passed laws limiting the number of animals that could be sacrificed in various religious rituals. And this actually caused a lot of conflict because Ashoka was interfering in the religious lives of his subjects, which was another principle that he upheld was religious tolerance. But there was conflict there as Ashoka attempted to limit the number of animals that could be killed for certain festivals. Nonetheless, he stridently attempted to do so. He attempted to increase the welfare of his entire population, both people and animals. He put into place houses for the poor, the indigent. On top of this, he actually sent around some of the world's earliest veterinarians to take care of animals that were in distress. While he was a Buddhist, and a very fervent Buddhist, he respected all of his subjects' religions, and he refused to allow any one religious tradition to impose itself legally or autocratically over the others. So while you didn't have absolute freedom of religion, you had, at least among the respected religions that were mainstream in Indian society at the time, you could follow your own religion in peace. He also emphasized kind of basic morality, obedience to parents, being generous to those around you, being honest, avoiding adultery, avoiding violence, maintaining self-control, and he would reward officials based on their conduct according to these principles. He actually ended up appointing officials who, alongside the governors would govern the provinces. He would also appoint people called Dhamma Mahamatras, who were these kind of officials who would go around and describe the moral behavior of the people in various classes in the different provinces. And these provinces would receive tax breaks based on how moral the report was. And when it came time to punish people, he attempted to make punishments more humane. For example, he outlawed the removal of hands and feet for theft, for false witness, etc. Great historian Will Durant, one of history's first great popularizers, he wrote about Ashoka, and he wrote that Ashoka was one of only two great kings throughout history who also managed to be great saints, men who wielded immense secular power, yet at the same time lived a very holy personal life. The other was Louis IX, the King of France, for whom the city of St. Louis is named. He was a king of France in the 13th century. He was a crusader, a very pious, very holy Christian, and Durant kind of puts Ashoka on the same level as St. Louis in terms of the sincerity and genuineness, thoroughness of his religious conversion. Louis IX's mother, Blanche of Castile, she said she's famous for saying, "I would rather see you dead than in a state of mortal sin." Right? That kind of intensity was part of how Ashoka held himself. Right? He lived these Buddhist principles out daily, and as a result, the effect on his people, on people outside of his domain, was very marked. If you look at the image here, it's of the lions of Ashoka, looking in all of the cardinal directions. These lions are symbols of Ashoka's military and political power. Ashoka would have his edicts written down on these pillars so that people from throughout the empire could understand his laws and obey them. If you look down below the feet of the lion that's facing us, there is the wheel of Ashoka, which is now part of the flag of the modern state of India. This is a very influential period because it's the first time that an indigenous Indian empire has dominated the vast majority of the subcontinent. And Ashoka would send missionaries into Central Europe, and particularly into the far south of Sri Lanka, which is ruled by a particular Aryan subgroup called the Sinhalese, who originally lived in northern India but migrated to the far south to what's now Sri Lanka and conquered it and ruled it. But because of Ashoka's missionaries, the Sri Lankans will convert to Buddhism almost entirely. So the Sinhalese will be Buddhist up until modern times. The Buddhist missionaries sent by Ashoka will have a tremendous influence in Thailand, in Vietnam. The ones moving through Central Asia will have tremendous influence in China. In fact, there will be several famous monks from India who will travel into China and will preach and teach Buddhism there. On top of this, Ashoka's regime was admired far and wide due to its humaneness, its tolerance, the fact that a wide variety of peoples of different ethnic, linguistic, and religious backgrounds could live in peace and engage in economically productive behavior for the benefit of the empire. Also, Ashoka still maintained the system of secret police and some of the very strict laws created by Chandragupta, though he had relaxed some of the penalties, as I mentioned earlier. It was during the reign of Ashoka that Greco-Buddhist sculpture would reach its apogee, with the most pieces of kind of mixed Greek and Indian origin being created. Ashoka would have pillars with inscriptions erected throughout his empire, as I stated earlier, so that people could know the laws. On top of this, he will have stupas built far and wide throughout the breadth of the subcontinent. A stupa is a shrine, a Buddhist shrine, that will usually contain the relics of a great Buddha, a great Buddhist monk, or it will contain some kind of sacred writings, something significant to the Buddhist faith. And Ashoka had them built throughout the subcontinent, and they became places of pilgrimage and prayer for many of the Buddhists of the time period. Ashoka's successors did not have the great foresight that he had. What made his father, Bindusara, so great as a second-generation leader was lost on succeeding generations of Mauryan emperors. The biggest problem was that these emperors would engage in kind of personal decadence, living lives, luxurious lives, in which they kind of sheltered themselves from the society at large. On top of this, as migrations occurred in the north in Central Asia, the empire started to fall under threat from different nomadic groups, particularly as the Xiongnu or the Huns began to move west. Part of the issue was that the state continued to have to maintain a very powerful military, but when the state was not expanding, new loot was not entering into the empire's coffers. So the empire did what the Han did, what the Romans will do in just a couple of centuries, or a few centuries further to the west, what many governments have done throughout history. The Mauryan rulers will inflate their currency. They will reduce the amount of silver in their coins and increase the amount of base metals in coins, because you can't have a pure silver coin. You could bend it and tear it and everything else if it was solid silver. But you have to add those base metals to make it hard, make it sturdy, make it withstand everything that a coin goes through. So instead of cutting costs, you just mint more coins by increasing the amount of base metals in the coin, reducing the amount of silver, right, which allows you to mint more coins and pay your bills. You owe somebody 10,000 rupees, well, you can just mint them and pay them, right? Unfortunately, as the government mints more coins, the value of those coins begins to go down, prices begin to rise, people become poorer over a long period of time. This eventually leads to population contraction. The birth rate goes down. You end up with local conflicts developing after growth has stopped. Tensions between different religious groups become more pronounced, And on top of this, these migration pressures from Central Asia are still happening. They're still attempting to break down the barriers of the empire to invade and despoil and pillage the Mauryan state. And so the economy of the empire is gradually destroyed. Eventually, these nomadic peoples from Central Asia would break into northern India and would establish their own states. In time, they would become converted to Buddhism, but eventually the Mauryan dynasty would be completely destroyed by this process, and indigenous Indian rule would only emerge later on with the rise of the Gupta dynasty. In the Gangetic Plain in the east, which was the Mauryan heartland, a general, Pushyamitra Shunga, would overthrow the last of the emperors, Brihadratha, or the term that they used was Maharaja, right? The king of kings. We translate that as emperor, which the word emperor is based on the Latin imperator, right? The Roman title. But usually, when we use the term emperor, we mean a rank above a king, right? A ruler, a king of kings, right? So the Mauryan dynasty ends in 185 BC when the final overthrow by Shunga occurs. And Shunga will create his own state based on the remains of the Mauryan heartland in the Gangetic Plain, but he will not be able to control all of the various kingdoms on the Deccan Plateau further to the west, and we'll even see a resurgence of Indo-Greek power in the northwest in what's now Pakistan and Afghanistan. So a very brilliant period of time, very brilliant dynasty is brought to an end.